tribal lands, cultural preservation, and policy development, among many other things. And he currently serves as a territories advisor for the Colville tribe. Also, just want to give a shout out too as well for him. His mom was actually my second grade teacher, so shout out to Mrs. Cyrus. Anyway, yeah, just wanted to let's welcome John Cyrus for our keynote today. Oh, and then clicker. Oh, shoot. Did he give you a clicker?
Oh, I need a clicker, yeah.
Yeah,
that's right.
Sounds
good. Asti kukwast, in chas kuisai ai, in chakin sukanal kenal, nathan pasquaus, nathan metau, nath squak chinuch. My name is John Cyrus. I'm the Traditional Territory Advisor for the Colville Confederated Tribes. I'm a part of the Pasquosa, the Wenatchee, Methow, Okanagan, Moses Columbia, and Entiat as well. So it is I'm really glad that you all are here today. Thank you for coming, and I guess in our way, welcome you to Pasquosa land, this whole area. NC Cult is not too far from here, our fishery that we fish at. My grandmother, Margaret Dick Condon, was born at a fish camp just down the road at Monitor, right around the turn of the century. So she would always bring us back here to, collect cedar roots for her baskets, but also just maintain and pick huckleberries, but also just to maintain, that connection of what was taught to her and passed down. She wanted to pass that down to us. So in my presentation, the main topic is going to be about what do salmon need. As we look at, the topic or the theme for this event, honoring the past, shaping the future, and I wanted to raise that question again. What do salmon need? And as we go forward, I'm gonna touch on a lot of these things. And I got some updated information last night. Thank you. From one of our supreme biologists there, Casey Baldwin. He's doing a lot of fish passage work, and I didn't have time to put it all in my slides. So as we go along, I'm gonna give you some updated information as we go. So just real quickly, in my position for the Colville tribes, part of our job is to maintain connection to all of our traditional areas. So you can see the 12 tribes, where their traditional lands are, and we've got a small staff, but we work really hard to make sure that we maintain connections with those communities that are there, so that when we go back, they'll have an idea of who we are. And making those connections is a really important part of how you move projects forward. It's all about relationship building and maintaining. So I think that theme will carry on as we go forward. Just real quickly, as you look at those 12 tribes, there's, on our reservation, we have 4 different languages: the Insilkchin, the Nhamchin, Tokatimpt, and the Plushpum. So there's, we've got, in those 12 tribes, we have a real diversity of tribes, but also in those areas, one of the central things when you look at the different tribes, they're all named after, let me go back, all of the waterways that come through there: the Okanagan, the Methow, the Chelan, the Entiat. Those are all named after the people that live there. So, and it's, maintaining that connection, maintaining all those, making sure that people understand what those names mean and how they're connected. So Entiat is grassy water place, Entiat, and that it was named after the people that live in the grassy water place. So it is, the language connects us to the land, and that is one of the most important things as we go forward. Asking that question, what do salmon need? It lies in our language as well. Okay. And I guess in college I was a history major, so I'm all about recanting that history and telling that story. Entiat is the big river, and that river gave us everything. It was transportation. It gave us food. It connected us with our relatives up and down the river. So when we say our relatives to the south, our relatives to the north, they really are, because we intermarried with those, with each of those groups. And later on, as we get into it, I'll tell you a little bit more about, you know, our cultural foundation in doing a lot of this work. Our relationship with salmon, our relationship with those beings that provide so much for us. Salmon provided 60 to 70% of our diet each year. Our people depended on that food to make it through the winter. And to understand those salmon runs, to understand the cycle of the life cycle of those beings, we had to understand biology. We had to understand botany. We needed to know exactly what was happening during the different seasons, so that we could survive. And that was an important teaching, as I'll get into a little bit with some of our cultural foundation. The Musa Miquim is part of our creation story, the four chiefs. Entiat, the salmon, the Chinook salmon, was the first one to step up. When the Creator was asking, there's a new animal coming, but they're pitiful. They won't know how to feed themselves. They won't be able to walk for a year. And what can we do together to make sure that they'll be okay? And all the beings came together that the Creator brought together, and Entiat, the Chinook salmon, was the first one. I'll give them my body, and they can eat from our bodies, and we can teach them how to use us, how to prepare us. And as long as they hold a feast for us and they sing those songs that we pass to them, we'll always return. And one after the other, the Shaya, the serviceberry, Skamachis, the bear, chief of the four-leggeds, and Spichum, bitterroot, chief of the roots, they all said the same thing. As long as we will give up our bodies for them, for sustenance, to feed them, to sustain them. But as long as they hold those root feasts or those dinners for us and honor that gift, that's that first agreement we had with our beings, our relatives. They're literally our relatives. So it's super important that in understanding that cycle of life, you have to be a part of it. And there's a word in our language, tamachula, which means basically Mother Earth, but what it really means when you break that word down, it's all the cyclical life that exists in that place. And to be a good Scalux, to be a good Indian person, you have to be involved in that cycle. You have to get your hands in the water, in the dirt, to show and to, once you return to those streams or to those digging grounds, you put your hands in the earth and you say, and you introduce yourself in the language again to connect. It's super important to make sure that you're always connecting and honoring. And that's part of that responsibility as stewards to the land. And lately I've been doing a lot of thinking around when you think about rights as people, we feel like we have a right, we have a right to bear arms, right to, all these rights that we talk about. With those come responsibilities. So when we say we've reserved rights in those agreements with the United States, there's also inherent in there a responsibility to take care of those beings that provide so much for us. So these beings provide not just nourishment physical, but spiritually, and singing those songs and making those connections to the land. That's super important. That's one of the most important things that we need to do. There were a couple of other things that I wanted to make sure that, and it'll come out in the presentation, but there are lessons that get passed down in those stories that teach you about how to take care of them, and take only what you need, leave that area as good as you found it, so that you're being a good steward in all ways. One of the salmon ceremonies, we've got a number of first salmon ceremonies that we conduct. One's here, not too far away at NC Cult by the Leavenworth Fish Hatchery. The other one is up. This is a picture of Kettle Falls. Even though Kettle Falls has been underwater for almost 100 years, the people still gather at that place because it was one of the most productive salmon fisheries on the Columbia. And it is our responsibility still to carry out that ceremony because of what salmon continues to give us. So it is a matter of understanding your place in history, and the information that's passed down to you. For Pascosa people, we've been fishing in this area since time immemorial, and with the way we define our sovereignty is that connection to the land. It's so tied to the land that the language describes the very connection that we have with that land. So it's so important that we, as Scaluk people, as Indian people, we maintain that. Now, I talked a little bit about, if anybody's been to the icicle, they know how beautiful that is. I'm sure most of you have been there. For us as Pascosa people, our Ilmiquim, Entiat Ilmiquim, he oversees this fishery, and he makes sure that when that fishery is opened, it's based upon the kind of numbers that are coming back. Is there going to be a sustainable fishery? Will people get an opportunity to fish? Because it's so important that each person gets their opportunity if they want. And he has a huge responsibility to take care of that fishery, to make sure that the salmon spirits are being respected, that it's being shared in a good way, and to open up that fishery with a ceremony, first salmon ceremony. The first fish that's caught is actually shared with everybody. It's filleted there and cooked right there at the spot and fed to the people that are witness, and they bear witness to that gift that comes back each year. And it is part of that obligation we have as Scaluk people. And this is one of the values that got passed down. Everybody got an equal share of that salmon that came back. And in doing so, we show that salmon that we're not stingy as a people, we're not selfish. The literal fate of our people, because we depended on those salmon to help us survive throughout the winter, depended on that salmon run. So it was so important for us to take care of that gift, that beautiful gift that's given to us. And I said I'm a little bit of a historian, so I am going to have to put some history in here. So hopefully you'll be able to survive this part of the presentation. In our area, salmon have faced challenges, man-made challenges actually, in the last 180 years that are still having impacts today. And it's through our traditional and ecological knowledge that we're going to be able to find a way forward in this time. So this is part of the historical part. The agreements and the treaties that were made in these areas were meant to extinguish title to that land, and thereby extinguish that connection to those areas. At first, these treaties that the U.S. sought to make with tribes sought to make peace, because at the beginning of 13 colonies, the tribes had much more power, and as time went along, it became much more of military alliances, and finally the annexation of land to I guess feed that growing movement across the U.S. territory. Now, the courts have shown that these agreements reserved for tribes rights that they in the lands while ceding these territories. In this particular area, as we move forward in the history of the United States, Governor Stevens made these treaties fairly quickly. He was put in place to execute these as quickly as possible. He also was one of the supporters of Manifest Destiny, and it was his purpose to extinguish that title. And he also had a significant conflict of interest. So he was the governor of the Oregon Territory. He was in charge of the railroads that were moving west, and he was also in charge of making treaties in this area. So he had a lot of interest to make sure that these agreements were executed quickly so that land could be up for settlement. In this area particularly, the railroad that went through here, there's a really good video, if you ever get a chance, on YouTube. It's called False Promises, and it talks about the Pasquosa people and some of that battle that happened with the railroad that really did not fulfill Article 10 of the Treaty of 1855, the Wenatchee Fishery here. Later on in our history, the national parks was actually another wave after the Allotment Act that opened up a lot of traditional areas that Native people, indigenous people relied upon for their foods, for their traditional sites. So, as we think about, there's some really good work done on John Muir and the San Francisco area with the tribes in that area. If you ever get a chance, definitely take a look at it. Some of those earlier treaties and policies that the U.S. had, they wanted to exterminate that food supply. And certainly tribes played a role in the extermination of bison. This is a picture of bison skulls that the U.S. really helped foster. They wanted to kill off that food supply for those plains tribes to bring them to the table so they would agree to treaties to cede land. So you saw almost a complete extinction of bison that provided everything for the plains tribes. That same concept was put in place here as Stevens tried to, remove that connection of tribal people to their places where they fished. One of the first actions he took was to block the Nisqually River, Governor Stevens, so that it would put pressure on Nisqually and that, I think it's the Point Elliott Treaty. If they had less food supply, that there would be a way that we could get to the table a little bit earlier. And then more precisely in this area, Governor Stevens had quite the long and contentious meeting with tribes in this area, the Yakima Treaty of 1855. And it was not with conflict or controversy. He used, a lot of tribes they didn't want to see this happen, and they took their time in deliberation. And as Governor Stevens got more and more frustrated, he let them know that he also had the military with him to make sure that they would sign this treaty. Chief Kamaikan was designated as the head chief to sign on behalf of everyone, and that was for the Kamaikan family, really controversial and marked a time in tribes' lives that in our history that was just created, and war broke out shortly after that treaty council. For the Colville tribes, we've had, we did not sign a treaty. We, due to a lot of different things, in 1871, Congress removed the power of the president to sign treaties, to negotiate treaties with tribes. So our executive order reservation was signed in 1872. And there were a number of different iterations, and all of those, the current reservation right now that we have is the striped area. But we had a number of different reservations that were negotiated along the way to preserve our connection to those. In all those areas is where we would collect all of those foods that meant so much to us, our root grounds, our salmon fishing areas. So as those efforts that found gold or they found other agricultural uses, those reservations kept getting dwindled down, and the president would, through executive order, would reduce the size of the reservation to its current size. One of the part of that history that we see right at the mouth of the Columbia, once, even before this area was opened up, in 1832 was one of the first canneries that were established at the mouth of the Columbia, and that was the start of how recklessly that salmon resource was abused. They found a way to improve the technology around canning salmon, and shortly after that, became a huge industry that was exporting salmon out of this area all over the world. Hudson's Bay actually wasn't just a fur trading company. They were key in that salmon trade as well. In 1866 was, I guess, the first cannery that was established. So, 1855 was the Treaty of the Yakima Treaty. So, that's not too far from there, where business was already starting. And as a history of looking at the history of treaties, those treaties were meant to both extinguish title, but also break that path for burgeoning businesses to exploit different markets in those areas. And that's for a much longer talk. But there's a really good book that I encourage you all to check out. It's called Celilo Way, Indian Salmon and Law on the Columbia River by UW professor of environmental law, William Rogers. And it really marks the lawsuits that happened almost from the very beginning to stop the efforts to prevent tribal people from accessing their salmon. In this blocked area that we'll call, because that's how it's referred to in a lot of the areas above Chief Joseph Dam, were the most impacted and least mitigated. I was just visiting with Chris Fisher earlier about some of the funding back in the old days, because we're getting up there in age, where there was $1 million for the entire year for everything above Chief Joe. That's all that was available for everything. So things have changed quite a bit, but those dams permanently blocked and killed off our salmon run. That was our main food, Chief Joseph, and then later, or Grand Coulee Dam first in 41, and then Chief Joseph later in 55, permanently blocked our access to salmon. The Columbia River operations, the CRSO, is something that early on, the Colville tribes, we put forth our lawsuit in 1936 to stop Grand Coulee Dam because we saw that it was going to kill off our salmon run, our main food source. It was legislatively settled in 1997. No court wanted to make that decision. We've had a long history waiting for that to happen, but it only accounted for past land losses. It didn't account for future losses of salmon. And it blocked millions of anadromous fish for generations, over 80 years. The Columbia River was and is radically modified by this need for downstream benefits in power and flood risk management. This Leavenworth fish hatchery, both here at Leavenworth, Entiat, and the Methow, was built for the very reason that Grand Coulee Dam blocked off that salmon run. They needed to make up for that difference, so they created these hatcheries to address that. In 1940, the Colville tribes held the Ceremony of Tears, and there's a lot of documentation around this, and a lot of our villages around Inchalem and different areas were flooded, and we had to move graveyards, we had to move people out, but they also had to say goodbye to their fishery that provided for them the entire region for generations. It's heartbreaking because I think the reverberations of the loss of salmon still inhibit our people generationally, not being able to see the salmon return to Kettle Falls is just something that our people are living with. And it really calls to mind, we didn't think about, what do salmon need at that moment in time. We were more worried about power production. World War II was coming on as well, and they needed that power in California to build those warplanes, and they said they would take care of us later. We're still waiting for that to happen, and we still fight for that. The Columbia River Treaty was adopted later in the 1960s, and its main focus was around hydropower production, assured flood storage, for utilizing those Canadian reservoirs that would be built to protect downstream floods in Portland. There was a town called Vanport right outside of Portland that flooded. It was a rain on snow event that could not have been prevented by any reservoir in Canada, but that was one of the impetuses that they used to push this through. And when I say at this point in time, they did ask what salmon needed. And the U.S. sent a letter to Canada, the Canadian Prime Minister, would you mind if salmon didn't make it up into your area? 3 days later, they sent a letter back, we're fine with it, we're good, we don't care about that. As long as they had that, that ability to create those reservoirs in Canada. So I guess that is one time where the U.S. and Canada did ask the question, what does salmon need? And they didn't care because they were more worried about power production. More recently, the Columbia River Treaty was, the first iteration didn't include tribes at the table. The second revised iteration that just got passed not too long ago also did not include tribes. The Canadian side did include First Nations as observers, and the tribes were allowed to come in as expert testimony people, but we were not at the table. Even though some of those major dams are built on our reservation, and the salmon resource that should have been considered, we were not included in that negotiation. When we look at the legacy that's caused by this changed water regime, certainly we have climate change, but we have already changed those water systems right now. It's one of the most hydropower empowered river systems on the planet, creating the cheapest power source, power rates in the nation. And I'll get to it later, but I think these low power rates are attracting server farms that we already see have popped up, and the demand for power and those AI server farms are going to be greater and greater. This begs the question of environmental justice. These upriver areas that we live in are permanently flooded for downriver protection. 40% of that salmon habitat loss came from above Grand Coulee Dam. The salmon produced inland, but harvest at the ocean and the lower river, still remain something that we have to look at. What is the open ocean fishing looking? How are we regulating that? When we look at mitigation, and I alluded to this earlier with Chris, referring to Chris Fisher, 70% of the mitigation funds that BPA has is in the lower river, and only 16% of their funds go up to the blocked area contemporarily. I guess that's minus the $200 million that's put into place now, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But when you look at the mission of different organizations, BPA has that mission to provide cheap hydroelectric power to their ratepayers. That's their mission. When we look at those dams over time, they passed the Northwest Power Act of 1980 because salmon, I was looking at one of the graphs yesterday, and they showed an increase of numbers after 1980, and it was because of the Northwest Power Act. It required all hydro facilities have fish passage put on their facilities. So that's why you see a greater increase of numbers that came up through. It was the Northwest Power Act. There are only 2 dams on the Columbia River system that don't have fish passage facilities. There are 2 federally controlled dams, Chief Joseph Dam and Grand Coulee Dam. So we need to think about that in terms of going forward. How do they comply with that act that was passed in 1980? Looking at the Colville tribe more specifically, we now have a world-class team of biologists and botanists and everybody within our Fish and Wildlife program. They're doing just amazing work. In the late 90s, we developed this thing called, we have an integrated resources management plan, but we also developed a holistic goal of what we wanted to see in the future. What did we want to see our lands to look like? And it's really guided a lot of the work that we do. We have a 3P process in that integrated resources management plan that looks at if there's a project that's proposed on our land or in our territories, we send this project out to all of our programs and they comment on it, our environmental trust, fish and wildlife, history and archaeology. What are the potential impacts that this project will do? And they have to sign off on it before it'll move forward. So it's so important that we look at all the potential impacts before moving forward. More recently, well, actually that holistic goal sought to move things toward a state of quam. In our language, that means you're wealthy, but it's a different sense. It's not money monetarily. It's a wealth of all things, wealth of family, wealth of foods, wealth of resources and friends and connections. That's the wealth that we want to bring it toward. Looking at what we've done so far, we've been able to really do some amazing things. The Chief Joseph Hatchery right below Chief Joseph Dam has a goal and almost reaches 2 million fry to the Columbia River each year. And we acquire through mitigation funds habitat lands that are really important for both wildlife and fish habitat. McLaughlin Falls, Figlinski Ranch, Antoine Valley Ranch. There's a number of different places that we've bought, and the Hummingbird Ranch is located in the Methow, right along the East Chewok River, that have salmon redds that we're going to steward and work, but it also serves as a cultural foundation for the Methow people. Our Fish and Wildlife program has done so much work in diversifying the species that once we're here and bringing them back so that they have a place in that tamahula, that cycle of life, from lynx, sharp-tailed grouse, bison, wolf, antelope. There's just an amazing amount of work that our crew have done that really are bringing us back to that wealth of all things, that quam state. When we look at the historic efforts of Chinook and Sockeye, we've spent more than 20 years working with the Okanagan Nation Alliance on the Okanagan River, making sure that Sockeye are as productive as they can be. The shared harvest that takes place right at the mouth in the Columbia is key to our operations at Chief Joseph Hatchery in collecting broodstock, but also surplusing some of those fish that we collect for distribution subsistently for our families that want access to sockeye and Chinook salmon. This Dreamcatcher is a purse seine. That boat uses a purse seine that is able for us to take out some of the native stocks, the wild, as well as bring in the hatchery staff as well. So it's super important to do that in the Columbia Basin. Historically, I guess going back a little bit, there was at least 10 to 16 million salmon that came up in our area pre-1850. So looking at the number of dams that are there, we continue to work forward on this. I'm going to breeze through some of this, and Casey Baldwin gave me some stats that I'm going to read off. So I want to make sure that for those of you who know, the Upper Columbia United Tribes came together to develop a fish passage plan, a phased approach, phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is done. We're in phase 2 right now, but we looked at different pathways to address this fish passage work internationally, domestically, and through tribal. And that first phase 1 was really pretty much funded by the tribes. We came together to do it. We're implementing phase 2 right now, and I'm going to do my best to talk about that. Phase 1 really addressed, are there donor stocks available? Is the habitat available? What are the risks, disease? And we answered all those questions, and we looked at a survival mode, looking at what areas would be productive, and we moved forward, and we got some funding. Phase 2 is underway. We recently reached a settlement with the U.S. The Spokane tribe and the Coeur d'Alene tribe sued BPA for the CRSO EIS, and part of that settlement was $200 million that helped fund the fish passage work in phase 2. the tribes were fighting for fish passage to be, in reintroduction, to be included in that CRSO EIS, and BPA did not do that. So that was the reason why they set that lawsuit in motion, so that we could address salmon passage going forward. And we've been doing salmon passage despite all the concerns that we have. There's legacy pollution, and we can go through a lot of that, but I'm running a little bit short on time, so I want to make sure I get through this. But the key takeaway is that salmon passage is taking place. This is a picture of a salmon that was released on the Spokane Reservation and returned in 2017 without any changes to the system, through several extra dams. And our staff at Chicho's Hatchery found this salmon. And once you looked at the tag and the floy tag, it's like, this came from the Spokane Reservation. So in doing those studies in phase 2, we're finding out how those fish move throughout successive years, how they move through the forebays, through those dam systems, to find the best possible areas where we can put those fish passage facilities. We're doing juvenile research. And some of those fish that we released, we saw that these fish, we released them near Grand Coulee Dam in the Mitigation River, at the transboundary area up by Northport. And some of the fish that we released near Chief Joseph Dam, they were spawning right there in the forebay. So, it's already taken place. This was in 2020. So we've got 5 general release points that I just pointed out at the transboundary, the Middle Sempuel, the Spokane River now on the Spokane Reservation, the Grand Coulee Forebay, and the Rufus Woods Reservoir. And we're seeing successive numbers of returns back to Bonneville. In 2021, we've had 398 fish came back that were released in these different areas. 2022, 447. 2023, we had 588. 2024, we had 2,118 fish return. In 2025, we had 4,361 fish return. So fish passage, fish return is happening right now. And that's without any changes to the system. What would happen if we did change the system to make sure that fish passage could happen in those dams above there? Those are the things that we need to think about as we go forward. And so Casey had sent me a lot of things, and these are old studies, so I'd love to share with you more. And I think one of the most important things when we look at, I'll get to a 2025 here. Release in those areas, we have to, monitor and screen and, look at how those fish are moved. So we have to go through a lot of processes before we move fish for those cultural and educational releases. This area is designated still as a non-anadromous bearing designation. That's no longer true. We have fish returning. We have fish growing in those areas. So we have to change that designation. For the future, we're going to continue with these cultural and educational releases. We have to understand how salmon move through the forebay, through those areas. And we have to keep asking, what do salmon need in these areas? We have to build that coalition throughout the entire area. What does salmon need? Part of our responsibility is to hold a ceremonial salmon fishery at Nispelem. And we wanted to, continue to teach those salmon ways to our children and to our coming generations. And we held this last summer at Nispelem. We blocked off this section of the creek, and we brought in our elders and our kids, and they caught, fish for the first time in 100 years on Nispelem Creek. And it was emotional. It was a moving time for a lot of people. So I'm wrapping this up with, a question. What does salmon need? Frame that in your work. What do we need to develop that healthy, robust salmon run that comes up? And one of my mentors, Jeanette Armstrong, asked this question, and really a statement. We can stay loyal to the legal past, or we can change and go forward in the future and look at what we can do together going forward. So with that, I just want to say thank you for this time, and thank you for being here, and I look forward to talking to you later. By Limlimt.
Thank you. On behalf of the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Group, just to talk to you there. Thank you for some time. Yes.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. All right, great keynote to kick us off. Okay, so we're kicking off our first session today, which is Watersheds and Restoration. And to kick off this session is Chris Fisher with the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, and he's going to be talking about Enloe Dam removal. And he's got a couple videos he shared that if we don't get to, we might show during the break, just FYI. So.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to lead off with informing you that this is a joint effort between the Trout Unlimited and the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, and we're investigating the removal of Enloe Dam. Over the years, I have led a number of site visits to Enloe Dam, and often I get the response, or I often hear the response of, wow, this is a big project. And I've got a little different perspective of that. If you compare Enloe Dam to other dam removal projects in the region, it's relatively small. You compare Enloe Dam to Elwha Dam. Enloe Dam, just on its physical dimensions, is half the size of Elwha Dam. It's 1/4 the size of Glines Canyon Dam, which was part of the Elwha Dam removal project. So already you got two dams, and Enloe Dam, there's only one. Furthermore, both those dams were generating power, and you had to find replacement power to offset those losses that occurred at those dams before you could remove those dams. Enloe Dam hasn't produced electricity since 1958. Also, with the Elwha Dam project, there was a hatchery constructed, there was 2 water treatment plants, and there was levee setbacks. Enloe Dam has none of those components associated with the dam. What it does have, though, is if you remove the dam, it'll provide access to summer steelhead and spring chinook, where's John Crandall, Pacific lamprey, 2,446 kilometers, 1,520 miles of habitat. Think about that. Put that in perspective, that's driving from Spokane to Seattle 5.5 times. So, from my perspective, it's not a big project, but it has an enormous amount of benefit, okay? Well, that's really sensitive. All right. So what am I going to talk about today? The rudimentary information, the location, the dam characteristics, a little history, why the dam was even constructed. Sediment evaluation. This project is more related to, but the management of the sediment behind it. I'm going to talk about the action alternatives in our selection. Elutriate test results. We're just hot off the press. In fact, we just got the results at the end of December. And then the fisheries benefits. And then I'll finish up with our next steps. So real quick, where's Enloe Dam located? I think most of the people in this room know. It's in the Okanagan Basin. It's on the Similkameen River. It's about 14 kilometers up from the confluence. It's a large basin, drains 7,500 square kilometers, and most of it lies in a foreign country. Okay, so Enloe Dam's characteristics, again, it's pretty small, 54 feet tall, 276 feet wide across the crest. It's thick at the bottom, thin at top, so it's like a wedge. Again, it's half the size of Elwha Dam. It's a third of the size of the Iron Gate Dam, if you know where that was. It was located at the lowermost dam on the Klamath River. So why was Enloe Dam even constructed? So gold was discovered in the mid-1800s at a place called Rich Bar. That's at the upper end of the impoundment. And at the turn of the century, there was about 35 mining camps established in the area, and they needed power. And if you look at the image at the lower right-hand corner, there's a water wheel there, and it would be installed in the Haggerty ditch. This was a ditch constructed in the bedrock. And it turned windings in a generator that you see at the bottom of that image. And it was supposed to produce 1 megawatt of power. Well, it never did. It made about 600 kilowatts. So consequently, Enloe Dam was then constructed to provide power to these mining camps. And it operated up until 1958. That's when transmission lines were routed up the Okanagan Basin and provided electricity from hydro projects on the Columbia River, which were much more reliable and much less expensive. So consequently, power production, electricity was ceased at Enloe Dam in 1958. So some major milestones. We're leaping forward quite a bit. 2019, well, in more recent time, like I think back in 2008, Okanagan PUD, who owns the dam, investigated producing power at Enloe Dam again. And it was a pretty exhaustive effort, but again, they reached the same conclusions. It was cost prohibitive, and in 2019, their FERC license was terminated. So in 2022, Okanagan PUD commissioners approved a resolution to look at evaluating the removal of Enloe Dam. And then in 2023, Trout Unlimited and the Colville tribes were awarded a grant through the NOAA Barrier Removal Fish Passage Program to conduct a feasibility study. And that was worth $2.3 million, and that got underway in August of that year. So I had mentioned that this isn't about dam removal, it's more about sediment management. And the first thing they wanted to know is how much sediment is behind Enloe Dam. So what you're looking at is a planned view of the impoundment, and it's a color scale, and it is indicating the depth of sediment behind the dam. So red is about 50 feet, and that's at the bottom of the image, closer to the dam face, which makes sense. And then the green and turquoise colors are about 10 to 15 feet in depth. Previous surveys that were conducted, they used bedrock as the historical riverbed. What this more recent survey identified this geological constriction, this bottleneck that's essentially working as a dam and slowing the stream power down and retaining alluvium. And so this is a profile that sediment profile, and they found this bedrock lens, this larger bed material, and that's indicated by the red line. And then that column that you see there, that's a core sediment sample that was conducted in 2022, which I'll talk to in a minute. But they hit a point of refusal at that same depth, so kind of corroborating this bed load lens. The bottom line is, if you remove the dam, because of this geological constriction, there's going to be less sediment mobilizing downriver, okay? And so what that resulted in, originally we thought there was about nearly 3 million cubic yards of sediment behind the dam, but using this new data and this influence from this geological constriction, there's going to be a lot less. So less sediment that's going to be mobilized, consequently less impacts downriver. So I had mentioned that the dam was constructed to provide power for mining activities. So there's a great concern that there was going to be a lot of trace elements, a lot of heavy metals in the impoundment. So there's a lot of sediment cores done from 2019 through 2024. I believe there's about 62. And arsenic was the most prevalent trace element in the watershed, or in the impoundment. And so everywhere you see the little circles within the impoundment on this image is where a core sample occurred. And where they're red, that means they were, arsenic concentrations were above what's called the CSL, or cleanup screening level. It's above this concentration that you start seeing, or they detect impairment to aquatic animals. Usually they use a little zooplankton, and there's changes in, there isn't mortality, but there's reduction in reproductive rates or swimming behavior. So we really want to keep under this CSL, or 120 parts per million. So where we had the high concentrations of arsenic, and I want to make this point clear, that it's highly connected or correlated with fine grain particle size. So 63 microns or less, there's higher concentrations of arsenic. And that's just an artifact of there's more surface area by volume with smaller particles than there is larger particles. And so there's just some more binding capacity. So where you have a lot of fine material, you typically have elevated arsenic concentrations. So where we had these core samples where there was elevated arsenic concentrations, they took the extent of that core sample, 100-foot diameter, and identified that would be the area that we may have to remove because of this elevated arsenic. So that's what you're seeing in this, this image here. So there was some surface, high concentration of arsenic near the surface, and then there was some well below the surface, and that's the delineation between the red areas and the purple areas. The last bullet on that slide, it mentions less in the reservoir than previously believed. Well, that's because the first two surveys that were conducted were in the second half, or the lower half of the impoundment, where there was a lot more fine material. And so we just extrapolated there's going to be more fines throughout the whole basin, or through the whole impoundment. We met with the Dredge Material Management Office, and they were requesting us to do a more of a grid approach, more core samples throughout the whole impoundment. So we started doing more up in the upper part of the impoundment. And if you think about it, when the dam gets constructed, the heavier material is going to fall out first because there's less stream power, right? But the finer material is going to mobilize downriver. Bottom line is, when we started doing more core samples at the upper part of the impoundment, we had coarser material, less fines, so consequently less arsenic. That's why it says less in the reservoir. So initially, we thought we had about 13% by volume of fines, and actually it was reduced down to 6% once we did this additional core sampling. Okay, real quick, the statistics for all this arsenic information. Just focusing on the top row of the table, you see there's 108 samples, so we had 62 cores. We did 108 samples of, from those cores, and we've got a range of 2.4 to over 4,000 parts or milligrams per kilogram for arsenic. So well above that 120 parts per million CSL level. So you compare that to some downstream surface samples, and what you see is that we had 59 samples, but the maximum concentration of arsenic was 140. We also had one more, a site that was 120. So only 2 of those 59 samples were above the CSL. What this is all pointing to is that the reservoir, or the dam, is actually retaining or accumulating fine sediment, and because of that, it's elevating these arsenic concentrations. If you release that, or if you remove that, most of this sediment is going to be transported because it's really fine material. It's going to stay suspended and transported through the Columbia River, or it's going to be dissipated out into the floodplain, and it's not going to have that high concentration. So essentially the dam is creating an artificial increase in arsenic in the river channel. So I'm going to pivot back to the volume aspect of this. Where is this material going to settle out? It's going to settle out near the confluence with the Okanagan River. That shouldn't surprise anybody here. Stream power is going to drop out. That's where the majority of the material is going to settle. And it's going to deposit, according to the model, a range between 1 and 5 feet in depth. After 5 years, that material is going to be mobilized and reduced down to about 1 foot in depth over the current bed elevation. Overall, the water elevation is going to increase by about 0.2 of a foot, about 4 inches, not very much. Direct your attention to the graph under year 1 up at the upper left, and all that's showing is just what I explained. You've got the blue bar that's indicating the sediment and gravel, and then the orange bar is showing the silt. So in the reservoir, if you remove the dam, that material is going to get mobilized downstream. It's going to settle out what they're referring to as downstream Oroville 1 reach, and then a little bit in the Oroville 2 reach after year 1. But you notice the orange bar of silt, most of that is going to get transported out of the system, and that's again where this higher concentration of arsenic exists. By year 5, about 90% of what's behind the dam, as far as silt, will be transported out of the system. I know some of you are familiar with this site and know that a lot of summer Chinooks spawn in this area, and so there's great concern about impacting those fish. So I want to tell you this story. It's not all bad. There's going to be definitely some sediment that's going to settle out there. This is the deposition in tons. So most of the material, 80% of the material that's behind Enloe Dam is in sand. And you can see that that's going to settle out in this Reach 1, a lot of it. And it's going to slowly, steadily mobilize down the system. But keep in mind that dam has been in place for over 100 years, and it's been preventing gravel from being recruited to this area. And we're going to get about 100,000 tons of gravel recruited to this location. We have asked the sediment transport modeler to see if we can get sorting of these 3 sediment categories at this location and look at spatial distribution of it. My suspicion is that we're going to have the sand settle out in the channel margins in the backwater areas, and this gravel, because it's heavier, would settle out in the middle of the channel. And again, I might be a little optimistic, but I think over time we're going to probably see an improvement in spawning substrate in this lower reach because this gravel is now going to become available. So time will tell. One more slide for the sediment transport. We don't know what year we're going to remove the dam, but the timing is we're going to remove in October. Originally, we're going to remove in August, but you can see by the blue line how much sediment is going to be mobilized downriver. And in August, you still have a lot of irrigation withdrawals, and we would be impacting the agricultural community. So we're going to wait till the irrigation season ends and start in October. But I think the interesting point here is if you see this big influx of sediment, which we're not denying that there won't be, but then you look at the yellow line, that's the current condition. It's really a sediment-rich system anyway. But by July of that year, 9 months later, we're going to be right back to background levels. So yes, there's going to be an adverse effect, but it's going to be short-term, and then we're going to be right back down to current conditions. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Enloe Dam feasibility study really quickly, and it should be available here in the next day or two. I think it's going to get uploaded to a website, which I'll show at the end of the presentation. So these are the 4 categories that the action alternatives were evaluated on. Each one of those categories had a number of criteria, and it was quite a process to go through, but enjoyable and productive. So here's our feasibility study action alternatives. Obviously, the no action alternative. A1 is the removal of the dam and then just full release of the sediment behind the dam. A2 is the other bookend of that. We dredge all 560,000 cubic yards of sediment, deposit out on site, and then remove the dam. And then the third one is kind of this intermediate approach where you remove the sediment that's got the highest concentrations of arsenic, and then you remove the dam. So you can see that this full release and the selective dredging alternatives, they scored the same. So we had to do what's called an elutriate test to determine which one is going to be more, would be more supported to move forward. Okay, so we've got a tie, we need a tiebreaker. So this elutriate testing is you collect water from the Similkameen River using site water, and then we looked at 2 different composites. So we had a composite that used sediment that had the highest concentrations of arsenic, and then a more moderate concentrations of arsenic. And what you do is you stir this sediment up, and then you, for 30 minutes, and then you let it settle, and then you measure the arsenic level in the water. If it goes up dramatically, then the arsenic would become bioavailable. It could be taken up in trees or in plants and animals. And so that's what you're evaluating. And essentially, this is basically identifying what the potential impairments to water quality would be if you were to remove the dam. The other aspect of that is how it impacts aquatic animals. In this case, a daphnid and a rainbow trout. Again, the same situation. You expose these fish to and zooplankton to different concentrations of arsenic. They get exposed there for 96 hours, and you see how much mortality occurs over that time period. So let's look at the results. Drum roll. So this is the water results, and at the top row is the site water arsenic concentration. The EDR Comp 1, elutriate is the high concentrations of arsenic, and you can see the results of the arsenic concentration in water when that was exposed. It did increase, as well as it did increase for the Comp 2, which is more of a moderate arsenic level. But what was surprising is that for both of these, they're both within the state water quality standards for both acute and chronic toxicity. When our geochemist is on the team, he saw these results and he said his quotes, over the moon, because he didn't expect to see these results. So this is really promising. I'm going to zip through this. The elutriate testing for rainbow trout. Again, really good survival, unexpected, especially for that Comp 1, which is the high concentrations of arsenic. Didn't even get to an LC50. Same with the water flea survival. Really good survival. I'll point out one thing here. If you look at the Comp 1 at 10% concentration, you notice the survival is lower than it would be for the 100% concentration. They tell me that's it's the inverse dose response. So basically, you have less binding material in the water, and so there's more available arsenic, and so there's more uptake, even though you've got lower concentrations. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but again, I just heard about this and like, oh, that's interesting. But basically, you don't have as much binding capacity in this water with lower concentrations, and so it's more available to the water flea, and that's why we had poor survival there, but nonetheless, not an LC50. All right, so let's go quickly to what the fish production is. And this is work that's done by Morgan Bond and Tim Beachy and George Pess. And when you look at those numbers, every time I present this information to an audience, they look at this and like, steelhead, 29,000 to 118,000, that's incredible. You gotta curb their enthusiasm a little bit, because this is if all 2,446 kilometers of habitat was fully seeded. Nonetheless, very encouraging when you compare it to our current condition right now. Those are natural origin returns for steelhead in the Okanagan Basin. And it's not something I'm proud to present when you've been working in the basin for 30 years and you continue to see this downward trend. So this past year we had 95 fish, adult fish, natural origin fish that returned. And then the dash line there is our goal, 500 fish, so we're way below that, and it's continuing downward. It doesn't look any better when you look at projected water temperatures. This is for 2040 in the Okanagan Basin. This is just applying the Norwest temperature model. All those red lines there, that's above 23 degrees C, lethal for steelhead. The other concern is the orange. It's, again, these are mean monthly temperatures. So even though it's a stressed environment for steelhead, because they're mean monthly, it's more than likely they're going to exceed 23 degrees C at some point in time during that month. And so consequently, would be lethal for steelhead as well. So really, you're relegated right down to just the green stream reaches. And so right now, thermally suitable, in 2020, we had 90 kilometers of available habitat. In 2040, they're forecasting about 40 kilometers of available habitat. So no Timbuk 3 songs here. Probably, that's a odd reference, but Google it. Anyway, so you can't overlook the amount of habitat that's available, but adding to that is the amount of habitat that's above 3,000 feet elevation. There's 65% of it is above 3,000 feet in elevation. And Mike Ward from TU and myself were up in Canada in mid-September, and we took a grab sample at Susap Creek. That's about 1,250 feet elevation, and it was 12 degrees. And then you compare that to water temperatures at the same time and date in the Okanagan. And yes, Loop Loop Creek, it was very similar, and so was Johnson Creek was the same, but all the other temperatures in the Okanagan that currently support steelhead are higher than that. So not only do you have a lot of habitat available up above Enloe Dam, but a lot of it is climate resistant. And by the way, that's in the Tulameen. Look at that gravel. Isn't that incredible? It's just no fines there. Okay, so in summary, Enloe Dam hasn't produced electricity since 1958. And in my opinion, it's relatively small to other dam removal projects. And the reason I want to emphasize that is I think if you start thinking that's a big project, you're going to think it's going to take a lot of time. And you just seen, we have 95 natural origin fish returning. By 2040, we're going to be down to 20 kilometers of available habitat. They don't have a lot of time. Time is not on their side. So we've got to act and act fast. Sediment deposition, yeah, it's going to increase. There's no doubt about that, but the water elevation is going to only go up about 0.2 of a foot. We're going to get increased gravel recruitment. That's been prevented for 100 years. We've got arsenic associated with fine sediment, but most of that's going to be mobilized out of the system. Our elutriate tests, unexpected but positive. Substantial amount of habitat for Chinook and steelhead. Like I said, the steelhead returns are low. The climate forecast is not promising. To maximize the benefit of this project, we got to move and we got to act fast. Next steps, we've got to select an action alternative. So right now we've got full release, or we've got the selective dredging. We're going to have a meeting with the Okanagan PUD and regulatory agencies next week. Hopefully we can come to an agreement on which action alternative to move forward with. Mike Ward and myself are going to go out and do the feasibility study public outreach with local entities. That'll be with the city of Oroville and the Okanagan County government. We hope to have the 30% design by May, and that'll initiate the permitting process. One last slide. I want to give a big shout out, a thank you for all the entities that have supported this project up to now, both technically and financially. That website on the bottom, Enloe Feasibility Assessment, the feasibility study will be uploaded to that, hopefully in the next couple of days. A light read, it's only 300 pages long without appendices, so you know, if you got a couple hours to burn, that'd be a good read. It's my time.
Thanks, Chris, for that plenary talk. And the next talk in this Watersheds and Restoration session will be Morgan Bond with the NOAA Northwest Fisheries and Science Center, and he's going to be giving us an update on the HARP process. The clicker, then the green's the laser. So. Okay. Yeah. Make sure that's
Get close. All right, thank you. Well, 2 years ago, our team was here at this meeting presenting essentially our hopes and dreams for this HARP model that we were just beginning the process of in the Upper Columbia. Last year was a bit chaotic. We had some staffing issues. We are now, just within the last week, sort of fully back up to speed on staff. So we're a little behind schedule, but we wanted to take the opportunity to come back and give an update on where we are and maybe introduce the model to people that haven't heard of it before. And really just let you know that this is a top priority for us, and we're continuing to work on this pretty diligently and hope to get some results soon. So I think, you know, some people might be wondering, do we need another model in the Upper Columbia? There's been a ton of work done already, and maybe that's fair. We're hoping that what we're doing is sort of a value-added piece on top of a lot of the existing work, reach assessments, existing prioritization, and that we'll be really adding sort of a benefit to that work that's already been done by putting a lot of that stuff in this life cycle context. The other thing is that when we were moving from Puget Sound to some interior Columbia streams, we wanted a place that was data rich to start this process, and the Upper Columbia certainly fits the bill for that. Again, as I mentioned, we're hoping this is sort of a value add on top of all the amazing work that's been going on already, and it really gives us kind of a boost and a head start for some of this modeling. Okay, so for people that aren't familiar with it already, what is HARP? It's a Habitat Assessment and Restoration Planning Model. And so at its core, it's a life cycle model. And so each one of these boxes in this kind of simplified steelhead life history is a stage that we might want to track the abundance of. And each of the arrows is essentially a survival or a probability of moving to a particular life stage. And so really the life cycle model that is the core of this thing is basically a matrix model that you could sort of run in Excel if you wanted to. The challenging part is figuring out how to fill out those boxes and arrows. And that takes a lot more work. So in fact, we have sort of 4 big components to this model. There's all the freshwater habitat modeling. That's what I'm going to be focused on mostly today. There's a main stem survival model that is sort of new to our HARP process. Past iterations haven't needed that. We haven't been in the Columbia. We have an estuary and ocean survival model. And then we have a number of models to look at harvest, hatchery operations, upstream survival, pre-spawn mortality, all to get those fish back to our freshwater model. So with each of these stages, there are different levers we can pull, different questions we might want to ask. For the purposes of the talk today, I have short time, so I'm really going to just focus in on this tributary component, and that's really where the bulk of our effort is right now. That's the main sort of meat of the work that we're doing is in this tributary component. really because HARP was initially invented or conceptualized really to evaluate these freshwater habitat actions. The other stuff we can definitely do and will be doing sort of an all-age procedure, but for the purposes of today, we're going to focus on that freshwater restoration piece. And we want to make sure that people know that, as some of the talks alluded to yesterday, we can't ignore climate change effects. And so that will be a theme on top of all of these things as we move forward. Okay, so one of the questions that we get when we're talking about HARP a lot is sort of what is the sort of spatial scale or resolution that we could model in our freshwater habitat model process. And I think there's sort of this Venn diagram approach I think helps people understand where we're coming from. All of the habitats that we include in our habitat model have to be something that we can estimate at scale. So really fine-grained habitats may be very important. We acknowledge that, but if we can't use, say, remote sensing techniques to identify these habitats, or aerial imagery, et cetera, then we probably can't include it in the model. The other thing is that we need to have a way to fill out, as I mentioned, those boxes. We need capacities, we need survivals, and so there are a lot of habitat features that we all probably think are important, but when we really start to dig in, do we have data on those? Really good, high quality data? Maybe not. And so we need to have the overlap between those two things. And then of course, for this to be a useful prioritization model, we need those types of habitats that we're estimating to be responsive to the restoration that we're doing. And so all of these work together in this Venn diagram. HARP sort of sits in the middle. We try to massage all of these to come up with something that is going to actually give us the results that we need. So I'm going to do a quick example from main stem habitats. This is sort of a cartoon of the types of things that we're working on or identifying. So in large river main stems, we have basically 4 habitats that we can identify or that we try to include in the model. Natural banks, modified banks, so places that are protected, riprap, hydromodified areas. We have mid-channel areas, and then sand or gravel bars. And so that's sort of the extent of it. We've chosen those because we can identify them, again, remote sense techniques. And we also feel like we have pretty good estimate on capacity densities for these habitats in particular. So if we just zoom in on one of these, this natural bank habitat, and we take those values, looking on the left-hand side, capacity, density, as I mentioned before, say something like 0.6 par per square meter, we multiply that by all of the natural bank area. We have a productivity or a survival for that habitat. And then we can modify that by temperature. If it's really warm, that's going to depress that survival. Those two pieces together, the productivity and the capacity, allow us to generate this Beverton-Holt relationship. And so for all of the density-dependent components in this model, we have a Beverton-Holt relationship that we fit using this technique. And so just for the par stage, this plugs in, and this is what transitions fish from one of these boxes to the next. And so we do that for all the habitats, for each life stage. And so this is a lengthy process. In the Upper Columbia, we are just about finished with that process. And I'll just show you a little bit of data from the Methow. This is the relative elevation model, darker from LiDAR data. So darker colors are lower elevations, lighter colors are higher elevations. That line that runs through the middle is our LiDAR-derived streamline that we essentially serve to hang all of this data onto. So we attach everything to these reaches. We use the prioritization reaches so that our data will be as compatible as possible with all previous work that's gone on here in the Upper Columbia. And so if we move to that same scene with the 2023 NAPE imagery, you can see that our analysts have hand digitized the armored banks, the natural banks, and the natural bars in this system. They've also done, and I apologize, it's a little hard to see the colors. They've also done braids, side channels, floodplain habitats. These are typically ponds and marshes. Backwater areas, so blind channels. We use the red survey data to identify spawning gravel areas. and then all large wood. And so this is wood that's large enough for us to be able to see in satellite or aerial imagery. And if we remove that, that aerial imagery, we can really just sort of get an idea of essentially the data that now goes into our model. So for one of these reaches, this is what we're compiling together on the sort of habitat side. In smaller rivers, it's a little bit different, but this gives you kind of a sense of what we're distilling down. This process is now done for the Wenatchee, Entiat, and Methow rivers. And so regardless of our life cycle modeling process, we hope that these data will serve as sort of a nice snapshot and comparative tool that can be used in the future. So there are, as I mentioned, some sort of ancillary models that we need to keep this thing running. One of them is temperature. Amy Fullerton at our center has recently put together a temperature model for all of the Columbia Basin, all of Water Region 17, for about 30 years at a daily time step for every NHD stream reach. This is available now. It's published a couple years ago. She's actually refit that model just for the Upper Columbia, so we get a little bit better relationship, refitting just for those streams. In addition, there are now climate change predictions using some downscaled climate change models. So we have, again, sort of past estimates as well as future predictions for the few decades in the future. No surprises here. We're predicting that it's going to be warmer, but we'll be including that in our model moving forward. Another model that we've just recently finished up implementing is this flow-based culvert passage model. So this is sort of an alternative to the WFW rating system. We call it the CLET model because Ryan Klett at the Colville Tribe turned us onto this at the last meeting here a couple years ago. We've now implemented this, so basically takes daily flow data for every stream reach where one of these culverts exists from the National Water Model. We take a simple physics model to estimate the depth and velocity through every culvert at any flow. And then we look at what actual flows we're seeing through those culverts, and we can come up essentially with a minimum passable flow, like what is the minimum depth that an adult is going to need to get through this culvert, and a maximum flow, and that is the flow at which the velocity through the culvert is too high for passage. And we can see just for one sample culvert here during a high flow, low flow, and a medium sort of medium flow year, that this particular culvert essentially during that midsummer period, so July, right around day 190, 200 there, essentially never has enough water. And so we would consider this to be a zero passage culvert. WFW calls this like a 66% passage culvert based on their slope and size model. So we think this is going to be a big improvement over what we've done in the past to deal with barriers, or at least culvert barriers. The other piece that I wanted to just mention briefly is this return on investment modeling that Dan Holland, an economist at our center, has been working on to help integrate into HARP. He's analyzed thousands of restoration projects and looked at the costs of those projects to try and decompose what each individual element actually costs. That's localized for each region. This is from projects all over Washington and Oregon, primarily. And so he thinks he has good cost models now for riparian projects, floodplain projects, barrier removals, and then main stem in-stream projects. And so we'd like to include this in our iteration of HARP to really sort of do some return on investment modeling, not just what's the best project to do for fish, but for, say, a given dollar amount. If you had $10 million, what project should you pursue based on this cost modeling? So I mentioned that we wanted to have some levers to turn in our HARP modeling. These are essentially the levers that we currently are trying to include: floodplain reconnection, riparian, essentially shade modeling, beaver reintroductions or BDAs, depending upon the system, in-stream wood additions, barrier removals, and then large river bank changes, so removing some of those bank armoring or increasing the sinuosity of rivers, along with sediment amelioration. And all of these things are done, again, as I mentioned, under the sort of current and future temperature and predicted hydrology. So our timeline, We're about 9 months behind our original schedule, but we're still moving along, I think, pretty well now. I think this spring we're going to finish up with all of our current and historical habitat analysis. That historical habitat serves as sort of a cap on restoration. By summer, we think we'll be developing our diagnostic scenario. So this is basically taking each one of those restoration levers and running it all the way up and all the way back, and doing some calibrations and checks to make sure the model's running well as we expect. And then we think sort of late summer or maybe this fall, we'll start really trying to engage with people, as we've done in previous HARP iterations in Puget Sound and Washington Coast, to start to engage and develop restoration scenarios that we think are realistic or of interest to the local community, and then start providing those results to people, again, in that sort of all-age context. So although we're focused right now on our tributary habitat model, all of the components of that model for the full life cycle will be available to evaluate in HARP. So we don't do this alone. There's a team of about 6 of us that are working on this right now, but we have a huge amount of help. BOR in particular has been funding some additional work to get a lot of this, this heavy lift on some of the analysis done. And then a lot of folks have been providing data. As I mentioned, Upper Columbia is data rich. That's what allows us to do this work and start our process here. So thank you.
Thanks, Morgan. The next talk in this session is going to be Gabe Temple with Grant County PUD, and he's going to be discussing climate change and small streams in our region. So, and the clickers there, the lasers there. So, all right, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, and thank you all for coming to day 2 of our conference today. If we would have held this conference 4, 5, 6 weeks ago, we would have had a difficult time even getting here. There was an extreme climatic event that dropped like a foot of water across our region, leading to widespread flooding. In fact, the Pashaston Hotel just down the road was underwater. Waterfront Park here in Leavenworth was flooded. Maybe you saw the article in the newspaper. I saw one where there was an excavator, and all that was sticking out of the river was the arm of the machine. The Wenatchee River was flowing through the Tumwater Canyon almost at 18,000 CFS. The velocities were high enough that it eroded or undermined the roadbed, leading the Highway Department to have to close portions of Highway 2. So unfortunately, those kind of extreme events are likely to increase in frequency and magnitude if we follow the current climate change trajectory that the climate change experts suggest that we're likely to follow. And I don't know about you, but for me, climate change seems kind of like an abstract thought. Like I read about it in the newspaper, we see it on CNN, but it doesn't really seem to affect me directly in my day-to-day life, or it's hard to make that connection. But as fisheries practitioners, you and I are going to have to deal with this issue as we move forward through time if we follow the same trajectory that we've been on. The climate change experts suggest that freshwater ecosystems in northern latitudes, like where we work, are likely to be disproportionately impacted by climate change as we move through time. Some of the projections that they suggest that we're likely to experience moving into the future is increased summer air temperatures, transition from snow to rain during the winter months, earlier, more variable winter, spring runoff periods, and longer, hotter, drier, lower flows in our streams during the summer months. So to try to be consistent with the theme of our conference this year, that's honoring the past and shaping the future, I thought maybe one way that I could apply this information of this to this group was to use trends and some indicator variables that we've seen over time from the past to the present, and then if there are trends, use those trends to project a little ways into the future to see like what is our climate change trajectory and these indicator variables that we're likely to experience. And so I use things like moisture in our snowpack. That was measured as a snow water equivalent at Trinity Snowtail gauging station at the headwater of the Chihuahua. I measured things like the timing of our spring runoff, the timing of our fall runoff, the duration of the summer flows in our tributaries, not only just the timing and the duration, but the amount of water in the streams measured as discharge levels during summer, and finally summer water temperatures. So just a refresher, like in northern latitudes where we're dominated by a snow or have a snow-dominated hydrograph, in the winter months, the majority of our precipitation falls as snowfall, right? The river channels, the actual flow moving through the stream is usually at a low level, again, because it's cold and the water is tied up in snow. As the temperatures begin to warm in the springtime, that snow melts, the hydrograph then increases. We experience our spring runoff conditions. And as the temperatures continue to increase, the snow pack diminishes, and eventually we recede into our summer base flow periods where we experience those, the lowest stream discharge through the season, and then eventually the fall rains return and the river channels become watered up again. One way that I attempted to kind of describe the timing of that was to fit the distribution algorithms that Wandu, master's student under Peter McDonald at McMaster's University, developed. And that was basically to fit distributions of a hydrograph and kind of describe that spring runoff period and the fall runoff period. And then I did that year after year, and then looked at trends and where the timing of that runoff was occurring. Here's an example then going year to year to year in Nason Creek. This will be our case study. We have an integrated hatchery program in Nason Creek, so we're, we kind of want to know what's going on in that system. And so basically I looked at what the spring runoff period was doing and what the fall runoff period was doing, and measured that, and then measured the trend over time to see if those peaks in flow for the different periods were moving. So with that, when we fit those distributions, it looked like in Nason Creek, the spring runoff was occurring approximately 8 days earlier now than it was about 2 decades ago. Similarly, the fall runoff was occurring about 11 days later now. If you believe those trend lines, of course the data is highly variable and it's noisy, but over time, the trend looks like the fall freshets are beginning to occur later and later, which means that summer low flow period where your stream is at the lowest levels are becoming longer and longer over time. In this case, about 19 days. So the rate is about, the change in duration is occurring about 1 day per year longer every year. Not only is the timing of the runoff shifting, the amount of water is also decreasing. So in this case, in Nason Creek, relative to the beginning of the time series in 2005, over the last couple of decades, it's about 21 CFS, average daily flow, less now than there was in the past. And not only is the flow changing, but temperatures are increasing as well. Over that same time series, we've seen an increase of approximately 2 degrees, a little over 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And finally, in measuring the contribution of water in the snowpack, again measured as snow water equivalent, over the time series I had available, there was 27 inches less water in the snow now than there was 15 years ago or something like that. That's a lot. So remember, we opened our discussion talking about the flooding that occurred. That was 12 inches of water that fell over that atmospheric event. Of course, that came over a short time frame, but to help put it in context, I mean, that's a lot of water that is not being contributed by the snowpack any longer. Nason Creek's not unique in this respect. If we look throughout the entire watershed at the stream gauging stations at the downstream ends of all the major tributaries and the sub-watersheds, the average daily discharge in August is decreasing over time in each of those tributaries. And that slope turn in a simple linear model is essentially a rate, right? It's a rise over run, which the slope turn is showing how much loss we're having each year as years on the y-axis in these plots. So every year we're losing, 4 to 20 CFS average daily flow in the tributaries in August. So yeah, that somewhat is discouraging, but I'm interested in knowing, like, how is that likely to affect our ESA threatened species on our tributaries? And we think about what they do, their life stages relative to what the hydrograph is doing. Eggs are incubating during that winter period when the flows are low. During the spring, they emerge. Some of the fry will emigrate out of the system at that time. During the summer, there are summer par that are emigrating, and again in the fall, fall par emigrating from the system, and then again the following year, our yearling smolts are emigrating. We know now that from some of the recent work from Mark Sorrell and Andrew and Department of Fish and Wildlife folks that fish are immigrating during that summer and fall period. It's documented now. However, with those low stream flows, and if those trends continue, enumerating what immigration is going to become increasingly difficult. We know from some of the tagging studies that the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Yakima Nation have done that pit-tagged fish are immigrating out of the system during the period when our conventional estimation methods with something like a screw trap are not operational anymore because we don't have the flow volume to be able to operate them. So if we take those trends, in this example, Nason Creek, and project that forward, we think that the flow is likely to continue to decrease over time. One of my colleagues that worked on the Salmonid Field Protocols handbook, 15 years ago, Greg Volkart, published the rotary screw trap protocol, and he suggests you need about 50 CFS to turn a 5-foot cone for a rotary screw trap. And in some years you can see like we have a hard time hitting that target as it is, and it's likely to become more challenging in the future. The Yakima Nation is implementing some actions to try and reduce those operational windows where we can operate the traps at lower volume, but again, it's going to become increasingly challenging over time. We may use some alternative methods to kind of supplement some of that sampling with electrofishing, but remember that the projections for our stream temperatures are likely to continue to increase over time. The NOAA electrofishing guidelines say if you're anticipating hitting temperatures of 18 degrees during sampling, like, you should not be electrofishing. So that as an alternative will also likely become increasingly difficult. So what does all this mean to us? Circling back home to what does climate change mean to me? Again, it's going to become increasingly difficult for us as practitioners to sample the fish populations that we are really interested in monitoring, because many of them are listed under the Endangered Species Act, and therefore the data is critical to be able to obtain to be able to monitor what the trends in those populations are over time. So just a quick wrap up. Our environmental conditions are changing. It's not really just an abstract thought. It really is affecting us and is going to continue to affect us as practitioners. And I guess this is just my plug that we should start thinking now about creative solutions on how we can continue to generate that critical monitoring information for the species that we're tracking, because they're likely to be continued challenges as we move forward. So that's it. Thank you.
All right, our next speaker and last speaker for this session before the panel Q&A for this session is Greg Fraser. He's with the Mid-Columbia Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he's going to be talking about fishery mitigation efforts for Grand Coulee Dam. Just like side to side. Cool, awesome.
All right, here we go. All right, thanks for the introduction, Ryan. We'll just get going here. So for my talk, I'll give an outline of the Columbia River, talk about the Grand Coulee Dam project and the Grand Coulee Fish Maintenance Project, and the mitigation that was done for fisheries because of all this work. So the Columbia River drains 668,000 square kilometers. It touches 7 states and 1 Canadian province. It's a large basin. I'm really going to focus on just the main stem Columbia and its major tributaries. In the gold here is the Snake, and for the purpose of this talk, we're going to ignore the Snake. So, Grand Coulee Dam. It's put in 1942, and it cut off 1,800 kilometers of the main stem Columbia and major tributaries from anadromous fish. Grand Coulee Dam wasn't the first dam on the Columbia River. The first dam was Rock Island Dam, put in 1933. And then Grand Coulee Dam was put in 1942. Now between these dams, you have 4 major tributaries, and most of us work in these systems. The Wenatchee, the Entiat, the Methow, and the Okanagan. They're highlighted in red here. So going back to Grand Coulee. So on these figures here, on the figure on the left, you can see it was what is now known as Banks Lake. It's a huge lake, people go out there and fish. But the reason they chose this site for Grand Coulee Dam was proximity to what's now is Banks Lake. Before that, it was called the Grand Coulee. It was this huge geological feature, this massive dry coulee. So they thought if we put a dam right here on the main stem Columbia, we would create this impoundment behind, which is now known as Lake Roosevelt. And then we could move water from Lake Roosevelt into this Grand Coulee and use that all for irrigation. So that's why they chose this site for the Grand Coulee Dam. So 1918 was the first time anything was written about the idea of this massive dam in our backyard. It was written by Rufus Woods, who was the editor of the Wenatchee World, which is our local Wenatchee paper. By 1932, this idea had lots of traction. There's reports by the Bureau of Reclamation, the Corps of Engineers, and the whole idea was that the power revenue from this dam would cover all the costs for everything else. We needed irrigation so we could produce food. We needed flood control. The free-flowing main stem Columbia would pulse every year, and all the cities downtown along the river would be impacted by this. So controlling this flood was a big deal. We also wanted to be able to move barges and move supplies up and down the river. And we wanted power. So put yourself back in 1933. We had just come out of the Depression. War is looming in Europe. We need food, irrigation, we need jobs, and we need power. So Grand Coulee Dam created 6,000 jobs. But they knew it would impact fish. And they knew and that fish was a livelihood for a lot of people downstream that were dependent on these. There was canneries, there was pound nets, there was gill nets, sport fishery, First Nation fisheries, commercial fisheries. This was a big deal, and they understood that at the time. So in 1939, the Board of Consultants put out this report, and then they initiated the Grand Coulee Fish Maintenance Program. And the first thing they did was they started trapping and hauling an operation at Rock Island Dam. So back to Grand Coulee. It is 168 meters tall, 1,592 meters wide. It is the second largest concrete structure on planet Earth. Only the Three Gorges Dam in China is bigger. It is the 9th largest hydropower producer worldwide and is the largest in the US. It provides a lot of irrigation, 530 kilometers of major canals, lakes, and reservoirs, and 3,200 kilometers of secondary canals. It irrigates 720,000 acres. So this whole plateau is dry, naturally. But we use, from Banks and from Lake Roosevelt, we irrigate this whole thing from Grand Coulee. But it is the new end of anadromy, as in 1942. We blocked 1,800 kilometers of quality spawning habitat. So for mitigation purposes, the first thing we had to do was figure out how many adult fish were moving upstream to spawn. So they looked at the estimated values from 1933 to 1938. They looked at how many fish came to Rock Island, and they looked at what was harvested downstream, and they assumed a proportion of that were moving to these upstream waters. They came up with this number of 134,000 adult fish. Now remember, this was in the 1930s. This was not the pristine Columbia River. This was extremely, the harvest was huge at the time, between commercial fisheries, tribal fisheries, sport fisheries, canneries. This was not what was historically present. So the first thing they thought they would do, there's sort of two parts to the mitigation efforts for Grand Coulee Dam. The first was to rehab these 4 tributaries. These were working rivers at the time. There were mill dams. Most of these basins were clear-cut for logging. There were splash dams. There was irrigation, was pulling water out. These were not very productive streams at the time the Grand Coulee Dam went in. So the first thing they thought they would do was move fish from Rock Island up into these tributaries. They thought this was low-hanging fruit. We're going to seed these populations. We're going to really help these depleted systems. So a lot of you have worked in or around hatcheries and you're familiar with fish trucks. These were the first prototypes. They built 8 of them. They held 1,000 gallons each, and they were able to move fish. They used these trucks to move fish all over the basins that we work in. They put weirs. This is an example of a weir on Nason Creek. They used the weir to block fish movement. They'd bring adults up. They'd put fish in what they thought was quality spawning habitat, and hoping that it would seed and help these depleted populations. And then they dumped fish everywhere. They offloaded fish into the Wenatchee River here from these fish trucks. And a lot of the work that we do in this room is built on past work of these fish biologists. You know, this is the 1940s. We don't know across the riverscape where fish are using what habitat for what life history. But this is the 1940s, you know, and here's a young Tracy Hillman out here, you know, sampling fish on the Chihuahua. So the second part of mitigation for Grand Coulee Dam was the National Fish Hatcheries. Now the Mitchell Act signed off on the National Fish Hatcheries, but it's important to understand that production level was never put into the Mitchell Act. They never said you must produce X amount of fish to offset the loss of production of these 1,800 kilometers upstream. But they produced 3 fish hatcheries. Leavenworth National Fish Hatchery, established in 1942. It's in Icicle Creek, which is a tributary to the Wenatchee, which is a tributary to the Columbia. From 1942 to 1969, they raised many different salmonids with many different sizes, some sub-yearlings, some yearlings. They've tried out a lot of things. Remember, at the time, hatchery production was new. We didn't know how to raise salmon in these high densities. We didn't know what would happen. From 1970 to the present, we have focused on spring Chinook, and the current production goal is 1.2 million. But it was 2.2, and then 1.6, and now 1.2. Water issues are prevalent at Leavenworth. So we're moving to a recirculation system, but Leavenworth was one of the hubs of innovation for salmon hatcheries on how to do this. So we started off in this black and white photo you can see, that's the Foster Lucas ponds. They're kind of long and ovular. Then we moved into this, in 1970s, we moved to straight flow-through raceways. This is what we currently have now. But as we've talked a lot about, climate change is limiting water, and frankly, we don't have enough to meet the ideal production goals. So we're now moving into a partial recirculating aquaculture. We have a part of our production now in the PRAS system with the idea that that will enable us to raise fish using less water. Winthrop National Fish Hatchery, established in 1940. It's on the Methow River. And they put fish everywhere. They put fish on horseback and trucked them up into these high country lakes and headwater streams. They dumped them off bridges, and they put them in airplanes, flew them up to the high country and dumped them off. The idea here was to use these national fish hatcheries to really seed these populations and help out these tributaries. So from 1942 to 76, they raised many different salmonids. From 1977 to the present, they focused on spring Chinook with a production goal of 400,000 yearlings and 200,000 eggs for the Colville Confederated tribes. In 1997, they also started to raise steelhead as a conservation species with the goal of 200,000 yearlings released. And the Entiat National Fish Hatchery, established in 1940. A lot of the fish health work in hatcheries was pioneered at Entiat. They had, again, the hatcheries were new. They had all these fish in really high densities, and they would get sick, and then a lot of them would die, so they had to figure out different treatments, different densities. You know, how dense could you put these fish before they got sick? So we didn't really know what was realistic at the time. So Entiat did a lot of pioneering of the fish health. It's located on the Entiat River. From 1940 to 1973, they raised many salmonids, mainly Chinook and rainbow, but they produced sockeye, they did sub-yearling summers, sub-yearling springers, brook trout, cutthroat, rainbow trout, steelhead, a lot of things. From 1974 to 2007, they focused on spring Chinook, and then that program was terminated. From 2009 to the present, we raise summer Chinook at Entiat. And if you remember from the first talk yesterday on the overview of spring Chinook, the Entiat was the only population that had a positive trend for the natural origin fish. They had a really low PHOS because it is the only system that's not supplemented with hatchery spring Chinook. So to summarize all this, we blocked off a lot of habitat by putting in Grand Coulee Dam. Estimated production of 134,000 adult salmonids was in 1939, so that is not near what the historic production of that area was. It was a highly degraded system at that time. And we created 3 fish hatcheries to mitigate for the loss, not to offset it completely. And again, there was no production goals ever set for these hatcheries. We didn't know how many we could produce in these hatcheries. It was an experiment. So currently, all these hatcheries combined produce 2.2 million yearlings, which results in 15,000 adult returns. So a pittance compared to what we lost by putting this habitat, blocking this habitat. So what did we learn from this? The hatchery production has never compensated for what we lost upstream of Grand Coulee. We didn't set production goals, and there was never an evaluation for how good we're doing in compared to what we lost in the end. But this was the 1930s. Society knew we would impact fish by building Grand Coulee. Society knew what we'd get from it too. We got power, we got irrigation, we got jobs at the loss of habitat and fish. And society made a trade. This is the 1930s. That was what they were comfortable with. Would we make the same decision today? I don't know. But that's the system we work in now. So just thank my collaborators, and that's it. Thank you.
Oh, never mind. Okay. Chris, we don't need this one. Yeah, we could have 2 mics. Yeah.
Ready for questions? Good morning. I'm wondering about the new NOAA assessment for habitat and available areas to work in, and how that's going to be integrated on the ground with the implementers. Are you working with the local recovery groups to start bring that assessment to the ground? I hope that makes sense.
That's a question for me? You want to know who we're working with on the ground to implement outputs of the assessment? Yeah, so we have, because we're still working on model development, we haven't held a lot of meetings with our regional team, but we have a team of folks that are sort of in the wings to provide us feedback for essentially what they want to see in the model, right? What restoration options do they want to see that they feel are sort of realistic goals or of interest to the local community? And so, again, that's sort of, we think, a little ways off, but yeah, that's a local engagement for sure. Probably be a lot, you know, in the past implementations of this model in Puget Sound and in Washington Coast, that ended up being a lot of meetings in order to really nail down what people wanted to see, and I imagine it will be similar here, but we haven't gotten to the point where we've started that engagement yet. We're sort of on the data side right now. So I'm sorry that's not probably a super satisfying answer, but we do have a process in place that we've used in other places that I think has worked well that we're planning to implement again here as well.
So I have a question about the HARP model as well. I don't remember, did you guys include temperature data, and have you thought about adding a temperature layer from the infrared data that's been collected?
When you say the infrared data, you mean like looking at thermal refugia, something like that?
Yeah, because it seems like that would be another useful thing with what you're already analyzing.
Yes.
Is it like, it looks like a good spot, unfortunately it's really hot.
Yeah.
Or it looks like a good spot and there seems to be groundwater input.
Yep. So we do have a temperature model that is much more detailed and finer grained than what we've ever used in the past, which I think is great. It's still not fine enough that it on its own identifies things like thermal refugia, other than you know, we know where cooler tributaries are coming in, something like that. But we are sort of looking into using some of that thermal infrared data. We haven't implemented it in our model before, and so we're not sure how that's going to go, but we are looking, we have a lot of those data now, and we're looking at that as an opportunity, because that is something that we could apply as, you know, we have kind of our base model, provides basic capacity for each reach, and then we have these modifiers, as I think I mentioned, where temperature is one of them, and so we could easily add a modifier for a reach for something like if known thermal refugia in a particular reach.
I was just going to piggyback too on the first question that we've been, UCSRB has been coordinating with the NOAA Northwest Fishery Science Center. We'll be like that big launch meeting we had like almost a year ago now. We'll do a similar meeting, maybe more centrally located, maybe McChellan or something. We were in Wenatchee or East Wenatchee last time, but we'll definitely be doing a big meeting and announcing that in the Watts and the RTT. So stay tuned per the timeline that Morgan mentioned. So.
Hi, this question is originally for Gabriel, but it really would address it to the entire panel. Those were some pretty grim predictions, and you talked about the implications for sampling of fisheries, but I'm also really curious about how those findings inform restoration strategies. Is there any hope?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. I mean, I hate leaving an unoptimistic view that we're doomed. I think there are some strategies to help combat those things. I'm not the person to answer those questions as a fish biologist. I think we would need to rely on more of our habitat folks. We have some pretty bright habitat folks in the room, maybe the Phil Roneys of the world would offer some suggestions, but I think things that can like combat those effects that we see in the data, like increasing stream temperatures, well, we need to lower stream temperatures, so implement restoration strategies that have riparian shade cover, maybe adding complexity to stream channels at high elevations to hold water back or recharge aquifer. Those kinds of things would be strategies to implement. I'm not the one to comment on how effective it's likely to be because I have no idea. But yeah, thanks. It's a great question.
I'll just say that we do include, like we have a shade model in HARP. I didn't talk about it today because we didn't have time, but we have a pretty high resolution shade model where one of our restoration options is to increase riparian cover and ask, what that does. In past implementations of our model, the effect has been fairly moderate, I would say. Air temperatures drive a ton of water temperature, and you get benefit from shade, but it can only do so much. We don't really have temperature effects directly in too much of the other model components, but you can certainly imagine really localized effects from some of the floodplain restoration, where we're getting more hyporheic flow and might get really localized, creating some of these thermal benefits, but that's a little difficult to model in the way that we implement floodplain restoration. So,
I have a question here in the back, primarily for Greg, but maybe also for John. I loved the kind of complementarity of your presentations on the history, and it made me think about kind of a challenging conundrum where I work on the Floodplains by Design program here in Washington State, and we are often told, be careful of using the collective we, like when you're talking about histories and choices and outcomes. So that's one piece, but we're also trying to avoid like typical tropes of categorizing things. So we've used farm, fish, flood in Floodplains by Design a lot, and we're thinking about moving more towards food security, which includes salmon and ag, to kind of avoid that just simple division. And so I'm wondering, as you dove into this history, you kind of wrestled with that at all. So maybe not a super clear question, but any reflections, welcome.
Yeah.
Did that question make sense? I guess would it help to say more?
Yeah, I wasn't sure where you're going with that.
Well, in the presentation, it was we made these decisions. Would we make these decisions again today? These may have seemed like reasonable choices for us, and just in contrast with John's, Cyrus's history, which was very explicit about what those impacts of choices were on tribes, particularly the Colville, and how there was not that choice of voice, there wasn't the inclusion in the we. And I don't mean this as a really overly critical comment, but it's pervasive, and it feels like something we should talk more about.
Okay, hopefully I didn't overstep. I guess I was using we as in the... Yeah, maybe I could have chose my words better.
And I'm really not trying to put you on the spot, because I'm saying it in contrast to We want to bring people together in our language too in some ways, like the food security idea. So we lump and we split, and we don't always do it consciously, and sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it isn't. And so I feel like I put you on the spot in a way I didn't intend. It was more of a reflection of the challenge of how we talk about this stuff.
Morgan, I was wondering if you could describe a little bit of the inclusion of a food web model within HARP. If you currently have a module that represents that process, and maybe describe it a little bit, maybe with the context of some of the spatial inputs.
Yeah, we don't currently have a food web model. We are working on a food web model. It's Peter Kiffney at our center is leading that effort, and really started with compiling essentially drift data, like what is the invertebrate supply in as many locations as he could find. So Oregon, Washington, California, et cetera. And then trying to model that. Could he model, what the food resource might be based on the existing data? It's a massive data set, and it is, it's probably the biggest data set of invertebrate drift or invertebrate food resource for streams that you're going to find, and it's very hard to find sort of modelable patterns in that data set. The original intent was to take his food model and implement it into HARP and actually have a growth component. Right now we don't grow fish. Fish leave at a particular age, but there isn't a benefit, if you will, of places that have, say, more resources. Other than that, fish might leave at a different age, but we know that size of a fish is important. We don't have a way to deal with that right now. We were hoping this food model would, and it's just, and I think anybody who's worked with drift data would sort of expect that this would be a big challenge, but it's been even more challenging than we thought. So I guess short answer is our intent is to include a food component, but I don't know if that's going to be ready in time for us to start moving along here. So that's even further behind where we are with our model. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
Okay, we've got time for one more question, folks.
This could be a quick one. For the Enloe Dam removal, are you planning any downstream restoration, wood structures, channel modifications, anything to capitalize on the sediment pulse?
We haven't gotten that far yet. We haven't thought about it. There is a consideration of reconnecting some of the relic channel scars to collect or accumulate more of the sediment that's going down there to minimize flooding and kind of capture a lot of the fine sediment into the floodplain and not accumulate in the main channel. But we haven't talked about or discussed actually in-stream structures or anything like that.
Great. Let's thank our panelists from our session this morning. And just want to mention, I think we're going to show a couple videos. Chris Fisher, we won't have them mic'd up, but maybe if you want to be up here, you can describe some of the videos. So if you want to see some more Enloe Dam pictures and videos and hear some description, stick around. But yeah, our break is until 10:40, so see you back in 30 minutes.
Let's go ahead and do the drone footage first. Let's do the drone footage first. Okay. Sure.
Yeah, I'll just help.
I guess it worked fine. This worked fine. That's fine. Yeah, good fine.
Okay. Nope, this isn't me.
Yeah, maybe not mic up. I was thinking.
Just give me a couple minutes. Just I need a couple minutes.
Then I'm gonna be out here.